And thanks everybody for coming at this late stage. I know my limit is about 2 papers a day, so I admire all of you for still being interested. Philosophers have focused on 2 episodes in Huckleberry Finn that occur roughly 200 pages apart. These are occasions in which Huck has a chance to turn Jim in, to have him return to Miss Watson, his rightful slave owner, as Huck sees it. Huck is convinced that this is what he ought to do, that moral principle absolutely requires him to do so. But he cannot bring himself to do so, accepting instead that he will go to hell and renouncing any concern for moral requirements in the future. He thinks to himself, quote, "What's the use you learning to do right when it's troublesome to do right and ain't no trouble to do wrong and the wages is just the same?" Several philosophers have interpreted Huck's decision not to reveal Jim as a case of weakness of will. He allows a bare feeling for Jim to override a strict moral requirement as he sees it. He lacks the will to do what he firmly believes he ought to do. And so these philosophers think that the concept of weak will clearly applies here. I have argued elsewhere that this analysis of the situations is based on 2 errors: an overly narrow concept of emotion and a wrong analysis of weakness of will. First, emotions are not bare feelings, as are sensations, but especially intentional emotions directed at objects, such as sympathy, include a cognitive component in the form of an implicit evaluative judgment. Here, Huck's empathy and sympathy for Jim includes implicit recognition that he's in trouble and needs help. Second, weakness of will is not failing to do what one believes one ought to do, although it can take that form, but more generally, failing to act on the strongest reasons of which one is in some sense aware. Huck's feeling for Jim implicitly recognizes the reasons to help him, which are stronger than the reasons to turn him in. Huck is not giving in to a bare urge here, as is typical in cases of weak will, as when I give in to my urge to smoke when I know there are stronger reasons not to, but is responding to his strongest moral reasons. Instead of being weak and taking the path of least resistance, as is typical in cases of weak will, he's heroically placing himself at great risk to save his friend. What the proper analysis of these beautifully ironic passages shows from a philosophical point of view is the triumph of Hume over Kant, neither of whom were read by Twain. Hume famously argues that morality is fundamentally a matter of sentiment, not reason, which plays only a preliminary and critical role. All the morally relevant facts of a situation must be known before we can react in a morally appropriate way, with empathetic feelings towards all involved. Reason presents such facts and corrects for our bias toward those near and dear. In regard to the latter, Hume says that while empathy is more naturally directed at those in our immediate vicinity, when we think in moral terms, we recognize the moral worth of actions by heroes distant in space and time in the same way as we applaud local heroes. Reason corrects for our initial empathetic bias, but empathy remains the generalized basis for moral responses. Kant famously argues that we must universalize the principles on which we act. Moral requirements must apply to all rational beings, and so cannot rest on feelings that some happen to have, as Hume held, although Hume thought that all humans had some concern for the well-being of others. Having argued further that even intended consequences are irrelevant to the moral status of actions, since good consequences can be intended for the wrong reasons, Kant concludes that nothing is left to determine what is morally required except moral law itself, the form of law, or universality. In order to assess the moral permissibility of an action, we must try to see if we can will the same action for all in the relevantly same circumstances. According to Kant, the attempt to will an immoral action universally leads to a contradiction in the will. But in Huck's case, he is clearly willing to universalize the principle that runaway slaves should be returned to their rightful owners. And so Kant gets it wrong. If Huck could reason in Kant's way, he would conclude that returning Jim is not only permissible, but morally required. Stealing another's property or failing to return it is indeed wrong, and if universalized, entails the end of property itself, a contradiction. In Huck's case, he could not will that all slaves should be able to escape, for that would mark the end of slavery, again a contradiction. But his sentiment of empathy for Jim saves the day and guides him to the correct but incorrectly conceived morally required action, as Hume would imply. The Kantian test fails Huck because he characterizes the situation incorrectly, as the concealment or return of rightfully owned property. Kant's test does not block this characterization, and it is not clear to me that universalizing, turning people in a certain group, into sellable slaves generates a contradiction. I would not will myself to be sold as a slave, but that might be irrelevant if there were a relevant difference between me and those eligible for slavery. What blocks such differentiating properties from being relevant is the empathy we ought to feel for all other humans when we interact with them. Knowing that they feel as we do shows that other properties in which we differ to be irrelevant. For Hume, a person of good character has the right feelings in the right circumstances. Huck displays good moral character in saving Jim, since his sympathetic moral feelings reflect who he is better than his false moral beliefs from which he is alienated. But his moral character is only partially developed. He remains morally flawed for two reasons. First, he fails to generalize his empathy for Jim to all slaves. If Kant requires the Humean addition of proper feeling in order to properly characterize situations to which the universalization test can be applied, Hume requires the Kantian generalizing move in order to characterize a fully moral agent. And indeed, he does require it in his account of moral judgment, partially anticipating Kant. For Hume, moral judgments and the feelings they express must be universal in two senses. The feelings they express must be shared by all, and they must apply to all equally. In regard to the latter, he says that empathy, which is directed at particular individuals, must generalize into the universal sentiment of humanity, that's his term, an equal regard for all human beings. It is the sentiment of humanity, which can be captured in general principles, that require actions motivated by this feeling, that grounds true moral judgments. Hume describes it as follows: a, quote, sentiment so universal and comprehensive as to extend to all mankind, and render the actions and conduct, even of the persons the most remote, an object of applause or censure, according as they agree or disagree with that rule of right which is established. This sentiment Huck Finn fails to achieve. When asked whether anyone was hurt in a boat accident that is a figment of his very active and self-serving imagination, he responds, "Nomen, kilda, N-word." Huck is not simply assuming the attitude of his interlocutor here, he's expressing his own incomplete and still badly flawed moral development. He clearly fails to recognize that all slaves are human and deserve the same respect he feels for Jim. He fails to generalize his empathy into a sentiment of humanity, to extend his moral feeling to all those not relevantly different from Jim or from himself as human beings. Second, the last chapters in the book reveal that Huck remains even more deeply morally flawed in capitulating to intensely felt peer pressure from Tom, who clearly lacks any morally relevant, morally motivational feeling for Jim. Alone knowing that Jim has already been legally freed, Tom Sawyer constructs an elaborate role-playing game of escape with cruel consequences for Jim. It is not that Tom is sadistic, he is simply obsessed with his role-playing, as is evident from his willingness to sacrifice himself for the narrative of the game after being shot. Huck, despite some qualms and unsuccessful attempts to talk Tom out of some of the more lurid aspects of the game, cooperates in the absurd antics. Even his fondness for Jim is unable to overcome his innate human tendency toward tribalism and consequent subjection to an admired peer from a somewhat higher social class. In the face of such peer pressure back in his old society, Huck regresses even in his feeling for Jim, which was so strong in the natural surroundings of the river. While Huck sees himself as morally worse than he is, if we focus only on the previously analyzed passages and ignore the later chapters, we will see him as better than he is. Despite a naturally kind disposition, he remains flawed, both in failing to generalize his narrowly directed empathy for Jim and in failing to be guided even by that feeling when in the presence of Tom. Tom is born into a higher class than his Huck, but is a member of the same tribe, that is pre-Civil War Southern, and a friend to boot, so that Huck is unable to resist his influence. This acquiescence in Tom's plots comes much closer to weakness of will than does his earlier refusal to reveal Jim's whereabouts. Here, Huck is giving in to his feeling of reverence for Tom at the expense of his naturally kind disposition, reflective of his stronger moral reasons to spare Jim pain and humiliation. I will now ignore Twain's admonishing introductory notice, recognizing again its ironic intent, which is very clear. I will then very briefly draw some morals from our brief characterization of Huck's promising but stunted moral development. Surely, given the almost ubiquitous irony, Twain intends a comparison of Huck's pre-Civil War society to the society of his day, and by extension to ours, just as he uses medieval England as a model of contemporary social ills in the Connecticut Yankee. Surely he expects us to identify with his hero, who reflects not only pre- but post-Civil War, and indeed our own struggle in overcoming the history of slavery. We can now see in Huck's ambivalent attitude towards slaves a mirror of our white society's attitudes towards African Americans, the persistence of racist attitudes despite piecemeal progress. As many have pointed out, even Twain, in his portrayal of Jim as naive and subservient, despite his highly admirable moral character, has not escaped the negative stereotype. More precisely, we see in Huck's failure to generalize his strong feeling of empathy or sympathy for Jim that relationships with single black individuals or families are often insufficient to overcome prejudices absorbed from adults from an early age, a narrow group or tribal identifications, and the sectarian attitudes they support. That's why so many racists can truly say, quote, "Some of my best friends are black." We as a society exhibit the same schizophrenic failure to generalize, able to elect an African American president twice while allowing racist practices and institutions to persist. The highly intelligent, articulate, morally minded African American is too often perceived as the exception, just as when Jim risks his freedom and life to help a doctor nurse Tom after the shooting, despite the way Tom has treated him, Huck says, "I knowed he was white inside." The highest praise Huck and we bestow on a member of another tribe is, "He's just like us," while still believing that other members of that outside tribe are not. The graduation to "they're just like us" is an all too elusive process. If such personal relationships with individuals from other groups are insufficient to overcome long ingrained attitudes shaped by authority figures and the pressure exerted by one's peers, what is the answer? The only one I know of is more such relationships. We need a more highly integrated society with more positive cooperative goals and interactions, with equal participation or equal roles among members of different racial, economic, and ethnic groups. Obviously, this is not a novel, startling, or utopian suggestion, and we are perhaps moving in that direction in fits and starts. It might be challenged by pointing to areas in which there is much interaction across races, and yet racist attitudes persist. Police, for example, interact with people from all racial and ethnic groups, and yet institutional racism remains a problem in many police departments. This is not really a counterexample, however, since interactions between police and others are often antagonistic, if not violent, and the roles are certainly not equal, authority lying exclusively with the police. I have argued that positive cooperative endeavors among those playing equal roles, as illustrated by Huck and Jim on the raft, are the key to mutual respect and, when widespread, to the broad empathy that grounds moral relations according to Hume and implicitly Twain. We do not seem to find visible racist attitudes among members of athletic teams, for example. They are mutually engaged in much more cooperative endeavors with common goals. They might come to dislike members of other teams, but their teams are both diverse and mutually supportive, a good model for society as a whole. What stands in the way of this sort of antidote to racism is, again, strong tribal identification and peer and authority pressure within the tribe, both of which lead to both voluntary and involuntary segregation in society. And the lack of widespread cooperative interaction again fails to engender a generalizing empathy among members of the different groups. Given Huck Finn's society, the move to universal empathy is perhaps impossible for him. His moral development has perhaps already run its course without achieving full moral agency. He has the alternative, however, of fleeing the corrupting influence of peers and authority figures who attempt to, quote, civilize him. He can escape to the river or the West, as he intends at the end of the novel. Where can we escape to? Our society is both worse and better than his, worse in that our rivers are polluted or dried up, and the West is no different from the East, better in that social and economic interaction is both more widespread, more diverse, and more equal, but still limited and stratified, so that many communities and schools remain de facto segregated. We all therefore retain our pejorative stereotypes in relation to some alien groups with whom we have only limited acquaintance. Speaking from personal experience, the alien and suspect hostile group of my childhood were Christians, so that my non-Jewish college girlfriends were met not with just suspicion, but alarm on the part of my parents. Again, however, piecemeal progress across generations, as in the case of Huck, and certainly Twain.